Excellent. How are you going, people? Good afternoon. I'd like to open by acknowledging that we are gathered here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung land, and I'd also like to pay my respects to the broader Kulin Nation mob down in Bunurong Way, St Kilda, and down to Wilson's Prom, I understand. The Wathaurong mob out West Way, so it extends out to places like Yuyangs and Geelong Way. The Tanarong mob, who kind of border I guess my land. I'm Yorta Yorta. I'm from a place called Cumragunja on the Murray River near Echuca. But yeah, Tanarong are my neighbours, part of the Kulin Nation. And there's always another one I tend to forget. Wurundjeri, Bunurong, Dja-Dja-Wurrung, that's the other mob. So yeah, I just want to acknowledge and pay my respects to those people, those custodians, their elders, and their kids too. But my name is Brian Andy. I am a Yorta Yorta man from Cumragunja, as I said, and I am your moderator for today. Unfortunately, Davey Thompson was billed to moderate today's session, but he's got COVID. It's still swimming around, so I don't see any masks out there, but yeah, just beware. Thoughts with Davey and COVID. And but yeah, nonetheless, we're going to be a great panel, and we're just joined by them. So I'll get each of our panelists to introduce themselves.
My name's Daniel Browning. I'm a writer, former broadcaster, head of Indigenous radio at the ABC, and former presenter of the Art Show, and kind of critic in my spare time.
Thanks, Daniel.
My name's Tristan Harwood. I'm a writer. I teach art at the VCA, do some editing at a number of publications, and my bob are Nalakan from the Roper Golf.
Hi, my name is Declan Fry. I'm a writer and board member of Melbourne Writers Festival, Australian Book Review. I do practice criticism, but I don't identify as a critic.
Cool. I guess, yeah, like... I guess I'm going to throw to you then, Declan. Like, who can critique black work? That's it, yeah.
Yeah. Everyone. That's the first thing to say. You know, there's a cop in your head and that's it. There's no sort of library police, there's no cops who'll say you can or can't critique someone. It's up to you to write from scratch. And, you know, in writing fiction, in writing poetry, in writing criticism, I can never presume to write something based on my identity, because my personal belief is that the writer's job is to question things from first principles. And I was thinking, you know, what is my identity? And when I went through it, all I could decide was my birth date, 23rd of August, I won't say the year. And that was the only thing I thought I can actually conclude about who I am, not even my name, because names are tricky. You have a name in your passport, but, you know, could be legally changed, could be a middle name, could be misspelt, could be different in different countries, the pronunciation. So as a writer, when we're asked who can critique black work, I say, first of all, everyone, and second of all, you know, as a person setting out to write it all. I guess the example would be if I write a character, or even if I critique someone's character in a work of fiction, I can't just say, well, because of my identity, I'm able to say this, that, and the other. I may be able to, but I can't presume that, you know. I need to prove it. I need to put it out there in the writing and open myself up to critique and put out the idea for others to then be in dialogue with, and they'll do their work of criticism alongside that.
I guess just on that, I just wanted to ask, like, how does that, like, in terms of structural privileges that might exist within the critiquing world, how might they play into this notion of accessing, I guess, that realm, like in published works, we're talking about writing. You know, we come from an oral tradition as Aboriginal people, I guess, but like, you know, critiquing is often considered a published, has a published outcome. How might you kind of factor in, say, structural or systemic privileges or entitlements or history to critiquing black work, or, you know, work more generally?
Yeah, and I really like, it's a great question. And I'm glad you asked it, because I'm not sure if it was the very first, I think it actually was the very first thing that was published kind of in the mainstream, so outside blogs or student newsletters, for me, was a piece in Overland called Capital Rights White. So I thank Overland for commissioning and publishing that. I mean, I pitched it and they published it. Capital Rights White, the title was a play on the idea from a French philosopher who said happiness writes white. Happiness writes white because you can't write happiness. It doesn't show up on the page. So certain things are very difficult to put into words. And capital is something that doesn't show up on the page, but it's part of the materiality of the page and of what gets put out there, as you say. So the structural and material conditions we work with, sometimes they're able to be perceived, sometimes they're invisible. But you're right, you know, that piece in Overland, I published that, I think it was partly in conversation with Ellen Van Nieven's Throat poetry collection. And it was a meditation on that idea that it's my opinion that it is a privilege to write, because it's a privilege to be literate. It's a privilege to be able to speak at all. And therefore, to have the privilege of literacy and the privilege of being published, you have a responsibility to use that carefully and to put something out there that's meaningful and to open up space for others, if it's possible, to always be never taking it for granted.
Daniel, I might ask the same question of you, but I'm just following on from what Declan has had to say. Like, we're at the back having a bit of a yarn, but just in terms of, I guess, that space making, and I guess that privilege, that to use Declan's word, like, how do you view that? Is it like something that you're very mindful of?
I want to answer something else, and that is the overall premise. Who can critique black work? I would say everybody, and they frequently do. Like, the idea that there isn't criticism is racist, because we don't do anything, we don't get out of bed without being criticised. And that's by our own mob. Like, inbuilt sense of the self-critic. So everything I write, I've laboured about. I thought, can I say that? You know, I think we just live in such a kind of structured way as blackfellas. I'm not speaking to Declan's experience, I'm speaking to my own. The criticism is already there. And so you're kind of always almost writing against the self-critic to try and say something. But I don't say anything that I can't prove, and I don't say anything that I don't think. I think the biggest danger is criticism that isn't genuine. Criticism that parades itself as criticism but isn't. Criticism that hides what it is. And to name yourself as a critic is not a shame. I don't do it regularly. It's one of many things that I claim to be. So there's no shame in this setting to describe myself that way. But there hasn't been a market, if you want to put it like that, in crude terms, for black criticism until very recently. There was no interest in black work. There was no interest, particularly in black people talking about black work.
And Tristan, I might get you to answer that question. Who can critique black work? And
Yeah, I mean, similar to Daniel and Declan, like, I think everyone can critique black work, and sort of following from Daniel, I think historically there has been a lot of critical, and I'm speaking from like art and art history here. Mob have always engaged in criticism, as kind of Daniel's implying, and you see it all the time amongst ourselves, like in various ways. And also just like if you go out into a community gallery, people are speaking about the work, they're discussing the work. I'm thinking about Nyapa Nyapa Yunupingu, and when she was doing these abstract seeming like bark paintings that are figurative, like hunting stories, there was all this discourse in Yolngu about that work, and only some of it is published. And Daniel was saying this in the green room as well, and so there's all that, and we have that. We already have that. We also have a structuring absence in art history and at the kind of high levels of discourse on art, and that black criticism that is unpublished is part of that structuring absence. And part of that is the fact that the premier art historians who have defined Aboriginal art to the world have often been white. And so there's two parts to this question for me. One is a political question about our representation and our voice in art criticism. And I'm kind of both Declan and Daniel. Like sometimes I like to be a critic, sometimes I don't want to be, like whatever, just the mood changes. So one is this political question about representation, and the other is a philosophical question about the status and the knowability of black art. And they're not mutually exclusive. The representation question enriches how we understand black art, and sometimes it's really great to draw on, thinking about elements in the Western tradition and like how that is inflected in our work, like whether it's just the fact that it's a painting on canvas, or it's sitting in a gallery, and like drawing that in is really useful. But I think, for me, the issue lies more in not who writes about the work, but sometimes where there has been a lack of mentoring for blackfellas by art historians who have made a career of like defining our work.
I'd kind of just say, look, some of the best black criticism, well, all the best black criticism is unpublished. You will never read it. It all happens in the gallery, it all happens out the back, it all happens hush-hush, or it happens at a community level. When someone does something, someone makes a piece of work that represents a community or a people or a group or a small number of people who are identifiable in a bad way, that person will find out about it. Ask any maker. And that's how it should be. Problem is you've already made the work and you've already presented it. So the white criticism of black work is just one, it's just one aspect of it. And it's probably it's the kind of least hurtful. We can be very kind of tough on each other and hypercritical.
I mean, I guess like in terms of, say, white critics looking at black work, I mean, one of the things that I guess the black critics as part of Yearamboy 2017, I went through it with Jane, the festival director, and it was under the artistic direction of Jacob Bowen. But one of the things that kind of came up for the need for black critics was to, I guess, be more robust with the criticism, I guess, in that published outcome. But do you think that, just following on from what you're saying?
Absolutely,
there,
I mean, absolutely.
Is there a sensitivity with white people approaching our work?
Yeah, I think they can't say stuff, but they have been saying stuff for a very long time, and they will say it anyway. Whether it's published or not is another thing. Yes, we have to be more robust. We also there has to be a critical mass of people, of black critics, and there has to be some kind of proof for white publishers that black criticism is beneficial, sells magazines, newspapers, whatever. So the market dictates whether we exist or not, right? In many ways, that's what it has become. But when we started, we had a specialist issue of the art magazine Art Link, and I was approached to guest editor it. And that was in 2009, so 15 years ago. And when we did it, we decided that we'd have all black writers writing about black art, and sometimes first-time writers writing about art. So Romaine Morton was in it, Jared Thomas, people who'd never written art criticism. And it wasn't terribly critical, but it was a kind of watershed moment. And I realised the issue was called Black on Black. And I realised that what I knew was that we had an insight into the work that would make it readable, that could make it readable in new ways, that would push its story in a different direction and would enlarge its meaning, which is the purpose of criticism, and also make the work better. Criticism is nothing if it's vitriol or abuse or it's mean. It has to be constructive. Well, otherwise, what purpose is there? Why do you do it? It has to be constructive. And I do it because I want the work to be better.
Yeah, I must agree. Like whenever I sit down and write something that's sort of a response to a black work, particularly, I want it to be enriched. I want it to be kind of to be celebrated in that sense. To Declan and Tristan, is that an approach you take with your writings and when you put things into words?
Yeah, so I guess when because I write a lot about Indigenous art, but I also write about work from white fellas, from various people of various different positions, and like I don't qualify the label critic with Indigenous critic, but there is a certain disposition that I have towards any kind of work which is informed by my own kinship responsibilities and my own ancestral responsibilities. And so when I'm in discussion with an artwork, yeah, there is a sense of who do I have responsibility to, and so I'm approaching all work with that lens. There's a heightened care for me when it is art by black fellas, because that is what I'm invested in and interested in myself. Yeah, I guess in short, that's the answer for me.
And what about you, Declan? I mean, are you kind of conscious of who's made the work, I guess, and whether you want to celebrate it in that sense or, yeah, kind of enrich it?
Yeah, you're definitely conscious of who's made the work. And I mean, I think when I say everyone can criticise, and as Daniel said, Tristan said, everyone does criticise. We're all, I'm not going to say everyone's a critic because that's a cliche, but so you didn't hear it from me, but I've heard it said that everyone's a critic, and it's true. I think that means that there are things that people say like, can't review your friends. And I would say, why not? You know, of course I review my friends. I review my enemies. I don't have any, but if they are ever there, I've reviewed them. And I review anyone. I don't ever want to think that someone's identity would get in the way of an honest, not even an honest, you know, I should actually say that I don't think criticism has to be anything. It doesn't have to be good or bad, positive or negative, honest or dishonest. Like, that's something that works itself out once it's out in the world and we don't have control of it. So for me, I'll review anyone or anything, and I'll bring as many things as I can into that conversation. So I guess one recent example was I wrote about the philosopher and theorist Mackenzie Walk and her latest book, which is a memoir, and I reviewed that in the monthly. And at the end of reviewing Mackenzie Walk's book, so she's Australian, based in New York since 2000 or so, I said something about, like, as long as you keep going, they can never catch up with you. And the idea is you got to keep making it up every time, you know, like, I think Bono said that after, you know, Rattle and Hum, when he was kind of tired of being Mr. Righteous critic of everything that was ill with the world. He said, let's go and dream it all up again and give them Achtung and Baby and Zeropa, and then they peaked and steady decline since then. Again, I've heard it said, didn't hear it from me. But I do feel that there is that sense of having to dream it up every time and go in. Of course, you know the person, either personally, or if you don't know them personally, you know them because you've read their work. So you know what they've put out there, and you know something about, you know, as someone who writes fiction, I think when we write fiction, for example, or, you know, visual art, I imagine really anything that can be called art, we're putting out some of the most honest and hopefully vulnerable parts of ourselves. So a critic has a very close relationship. And I've been criticised for being maybe a bit of a psychoanalyst in my approach to criticism. I put the writer on the couch and say, tell me more. And I do that because they have told me a lot. Like, they've offered something vulnerable. So it's not a misstep for a critic to be vulnerable in return and to continue a difficult conversation. I guess in conclusion, I would say, you know, here there's always that question of what can settlers do, what can black fellas do? We're all going to do what we like because we're here and we are together on this continent. And the reason I published the Mackenzie Walk piece in Schwartz Media is because I made a decision. You know, Schwartz Media have been criticised. I write for The Age, Sydney Morning Herald. I write for the ABC. Now, all of these organisations have been criticised, in particular lately, for the coverage of what's happening in Palestine.
Or the non-coverage.
Or the non-coverage, you're right. So basically, you know, there is something unspeakable, you know. We put these words, you know, genocide, ethnic cleansing, it's unspeakable what is happening. The point is that here, coverage or non-coverage, I made a decision to publish with all of these organisations, and this is me, you know, always thinking about what am I doing in terms of where I'm publishing and what I'm publishing. Mackenzie Walk's work, I was very happy to have an avenue to publish that in. And I don't think Schwartz Media is necessarily any better or worse than any other organisation. And I don't feel that it's my job as someone who's out there writing and publishing to practice a kind of hypocrisy in which I say, well, something happened which is terrible and I can't continue. If that happens, I won't continue. But at the moment, I would like to continue. And, you know, when we talk about communal criticism, something that spoke to me is the fact that, you know, Melissa Lukashenko was awarded for her most recent novel, Eating Glassy, at the Stella. I believe it was, sorry, Victorian Premier's Literary Award. Apologise, Victorian Premier's Literary Award. Stella, I think it's just a long list, so I shouldn't preempt anything. I don't know anything. But the Victorian Premier's Literary Award, and Melissa spoke about Palestine. Melissa also publishes in Schwartz Media, as do many settlers, as do many writers not based on this continent, as do many black fellas. Now, why is it that you can do both? or because you can, and because people make decisions. Why is it that we tear one another down as new, young authors? I don't agree with, criticism can be anything, and it can actually be non-constructive.
That was just an example of criticism. You named Melissa. Why? Why did you do that publicly when she's not here to defend herself?
Sorry.
Why did you name Melissa Lukashenko in the way that you just did when she's not here to defend herself?
Because I agree with her action. I agree with her making a decision to speak up on Palestine, and I agree with her right to publish in Schwartz Media if she chooses to, as she does, as I do. What I don't agree with personally, and this is speaking only as myself, Declan Fry, when we criticise people who are on the same level or below us, we perceive them as having less power. So much of Australian publishing, and any publishing, runs upon power plays, lobbying for identity, for power. And in the meantime, we cut one another down. It's called, crabs in a bucket, and many other terms. So I just want to say to any writers who want to be published, because I face criticism for things I've said. And young writers say, well, how can I work in this industry? Well, I'm doing it. Daniel's doing it. Brian, Tristan, everyone, many people in this audience are doing it. Don't be afraid of that.
In fact, don't actually go for that job if you can't handle the criticism. Like, if you work in public and you put things into the public, if you create artwork, you are basically laying a challenge, you're setting a challenge, you're saying, here is something, I give you this, in order for it to be judged, appraised, its merit discussed. If you don't have the ability to withstand an attack, you sit down and you shut up. Every day you have to be armed for an attack. You have to be prepared to defend what you say. And that's the joy and the agony of criticism. It's a joy and agony of being in public. It's a joy and agony of writing, of painting. Everything that you put out into the public is going to be critiqued. You have to expect it.
There's also the risk of being praised, and that can be really embarrassing. So you've got to be armed for getting a lot of praise and overrating. That's what can happen. You've got to be careful.
Can I just add something on Schwartz Media? And I've published with them as well, and I do respect the decision to use the platform of Schwartz Media and perhaps be able to crowd out that space, whatever. I don't know. I've done it before, publishing with Schwartz Media. But at a certain point, there was a level of contamination, which, for me, I became aware of through another publication that I work for, Memo Review, when we did publish it wasn't a particularly good piece of criticism, but the critic made, I wouldn't say particularly strong, but fairly accurate statements, appropriate Palestinian statements in regard to a show that was on. And so in response to this piece of writing that we published in the Memo Review, there was advertising that Schwartz Media had planned for a print edition in Memo that was pulled from the magazine because of the fact that we published pro-Palestinian criticism, or criticism of Israel. That's probably an easier way to say it. And for me, personally, that was the point where I came to terms with the fact that I mean, if I was to write a piece and it made sense to say something in Schwartz Media, I couldn't, in good faith, believe that what I was writing was anything meaningful, knowing what I knew. So while I respect using the platform, and in art, we are so fucking implicated all the time, whether it's funding from Zionists, from orgs that also fund the Zionist Federation, or for black fellas in particular, with our concerns for land rights in this country, how deeply we are in bed or indebted to, entwined with mining in the arts as well. So we're always all complicit, and that for me was, that turn of events was why I withdrew from publishing in shorts media.
You know, I don't think we should lose sight of what we're actually discussing here. And there is a toxicity in the air that is choking and making it difficult to talk about anything without ensnaring this particular issue. I understand it is deeply, possessing and upsetting and causing enormous pain and distress in the world. But we're here to talk about critiquing black work. And what happens is, in this environment, is even we get pushed out. And can I just say, I want this conversation to be about that, not about Schwartz media or their non-coverage of things that are real and the rest of the Australian media's involvement in that. This is about black work. And it exists on its own. It's okay to talk about black things.
I was going to ask, I guess it's something, maybe it's a little bit sort of Schwartz media-ish, but just post-Voice Australia, I mean, does it give more impetus to critiquing black work?
What the referendum did, I mean, aside from, annihilating what any residual faith I had in the Australian body politic, it made me more kind of anxious for a range of voices and a multiplicity of perspectives. What happened during the referendum was, from a media perspective, this false portrayal of an argument of sides of the argument which we were 50-50. So we were 50% of airtime to no and 50 to yes. Now it's a referendum. It's not like an election. At the ABC, we don't have to account for how much coverage we give a particular case in a referendum. When it's logical, right? There's no media, there was no actual campaign for no in 1967. because it was illogical. So this whole idea of balance and this false imputation, this false editorial independence, this false balance, was what really kind of shocked me, that journalism could become that it could just be this thing that you do. It's just like 50-50. No, what about when the argument, the counter-argument is nonsensical, or just don't spend so much time thinking about it? What it did was, the whole argument was skewed and turned into something it wasn't, and our understanding of what we were being asked to do at the referendum was lost. It became just about, the most Machiavellian thing that an Australian politician or any politician has ever said, and that was, if you don't know, vote no. Basically an insult directed at every one of you, saying that if you don't know, don't bother to find out. Don't educate yourselves. Don't understand what you're doing when you cast a vote. Is that like the nadir, the darkest moment of democracy? I mean, that's what I lost faith with a lot of things. And it's not because the referendum proposal was particularly something I could support. It was actually something I characterised as, this is a vote about my reason for being. Do I have a right to exist in this country? In 7 years, 2 votes, 2 national votes, on my rights, my additional rights, my extra rights, as a queer man, to marry the person I choose, who's the same sex, and my right to have some kind of, committee enshrined in the Constitution, just determining how legislation might be drafted to accommodate us. 7 years, twice in 7 years, I'm over. I'm done with Australia. If I'm still feeling like I have to argue my right to exist.
I hear you on that, sir, as a fellow queer man. But I mean, I guess post-Voice, has that kind of given you any impetus to?
I mean, post-Voice, and I mean, really echoing a lot of what Daniel has already said, and I mean, have or had my doubts about the referendum and the way that was put up, obviously, but what Daniel said around the right to exist as either like maybe like a political entity in this country, and the way that resounds through, I guess, when I'm reading criticism now, and it isn't someone who's particularly informed about the work, they're not Indigenous, yet they're echoing usually some very well-travelled axiom about the work, or taking it somewhere completely foreign to what it is. That just feels like that no again and again, and tied up in the media coverage that was happening, that the Australia was running leading up to the referendum, was the scandalising of Aboriginal art centres. So I won't go into it in detail. I'm sure most people know here where APY painters were essentially had their rights to exist as artists stripped away from them. And it's not about the uninformed argument about artist assistants. Like, we all know, if you're a journalist, you know that artists use artist assistants of all backgrounds. But it was like that artist's right to make a decision to exist as an Aboriginal artist being refused her in that moment, and that, yeah, it's just sad.
I mean,
yeah.
that stuff wasn't even criticism.
Yeah.
That was news reportage. That was like exclusives. That was, that kind of journalism. I wonder how much money it cost the Australian to stake Greg Birrup out in outback South Australia for 3 months. I mean, if that's what he was doing. I mean, this is the reporter it was almost daily coverage of this issue. And what was circulating underneath all that was all these false notions of what Aboriginal art is. That you're mainlining some god, some spiritual creator being every time you sit down at a canvas. And in fact, those articles couldn't work. They weren't logical unless you believed in a false notion of Aboriginal art. You could not understand them. They just recycled the worst and oldest tropes about us as people and about our art. If you look at what happened, the calculation that was being made by the executives at News Corporation was that and Sally Scales, who's essentially the manager of APYCC, chair, sorry. Thank you. There was for me a barefaced attempt to destroy her reputation, and she was a very powerful proponent of the voice and the Uluru Statement from the Heart. So by extension, the shit was gonna stink, and it has very little to do with Sally, in a sense that they're out to get someone else, and blackfellas are just like the collateral damage. The artists are the collateral damage. They're not really being accused of anything. It's an attempt to get someone else. And my concern is always with who gets lost, who gets hurt in that transaction, whose careers are ruined, and even perhaps the category of Aboriginal art being diminished. The whole category of Aboriginal art, whatever we mean when we say those two words together, is implicated. And that is wrong. The one thing I saw in that video, if any of you will remember, the one that was published online by The Australian, the secret video, where it would appear that a white woman is instructing an artist how to represent her chukapa. A bit more over here, a bit more over there. Bigger here, bigger chukapa here. What that revealed to me, and what made me sick, is the idea that the only thing we have left to sell to Australia is that which we hold sacred, The idea that someone should be in their old age making artwork to augment what little they get in communities where, you know, a loaf of bread is $10. That's sickening. Nothing in the Australian about that, about the lack of choice and the deprivation of right to live like everyone else. That's what really I saw in that video, and how tired she was. She wanted someone to help with the painting, because she's doing like 5 a day, or whatever it is. And I just would never want to think of my grandmother in that position, funding my community and its infrastructure because it's so remote.
Yeah, I'm just thinking Michelangelo had artisans, didn't he?
He did,
Yeah.
plenty. Absolutely. A whole school. They had schools.
But yeah, I guess I just want to bang on about the Australian too. Like, just it's sort of just work in that art world. It's sort of the Walker case and how the inquiries brought out that a reporter from the Australian, so they're not just relegated to those upper echelons of the publishing industry, but the reporter kind of on the ground said, or text the police officer, if you need a hand with you know, an article in the Australian, just let us know. So yeah, it's, you know, all those levels. I guess, yeah, thinking about the future, I guess, just in terms of what you'd like to see. I'll ask you, Declan, first, but just what do you want to see in the future when it comes to, you know, more black voices in print, when it comes to looking at black work? Or I know we're kind of pretty much on the level of everyone should critique black work, but just...
Oh, with reason. You know what? You know, Joe Bloggs from down the road has got no particular, you know, qualification to talk about anything. Critiquing black work. Come on, like, it's not just anybody.
Succession planning, then. I'm just thinking about what do you want to see, Declan, in the future when it comes to succession planning with, you know, critics on black work.
Yeah, Brian, I appreciate you asking because I'm in charge of succession planning, so I appreciate, like, here's the go, here's what's going to happen. Look, I do want to speak to, first of all, we're practicing at the future. I've been, you know, I've laughed, I've cried, I've enjoyed so many people. I would love to name names, but I won't, because, you know, it's about everyone who's contributed to this festival and what we're doing. So first of all, we're all up here doing it, and everyone in the audience is doing it too, you know. I do think Joe Bloggs has a right to critique, because I'm not in charge of Joe Bloggs. I'm not in charge of succession planning.
But do you want to read his stuff?
No.
That's what
I'm
I'm
in charge
saying.
of that. I'm in charge of, well, that's how I police people, by not reading them, right? Like, the worst thing you can do to an author is refuse to read them. There are worse things, but, you know, within reason. I want to speak quickly to that referendum too, but I'll keep it positive, right? Because, well, you can't be positive, but you can be positive because you can learn from your mistakes. So what happened was, yeah, I think all of us saw within communities critique, discussion. When I name Schwartz Media, it doesn't matter if it's Schwartz Media. I also name ABC, Guardian. I go on. I haven't written for The Australian, but, you know, it's not about a name or a person. It's about democracy and how democracy is a process. Everyone is invited to vote, but the reality is that blackfellas are a minority in a colonised continent. And, you know, the reason I mention Israel is not because it's topical, although it is, and, you know, that's why activists are working hard. It's because there's an argument about indigeneity over there too. Who is black? Who is indigenous? Well, since modernity, you know, there's been some terrible ideas about who is indigenous. The fact is that people are together. Israel and Palestine are together, and Palestine needs to be free, and Israel should be, ideally, and I have no place to speak on this, this is as a bystander, you know, a democracy with full rights for everyone from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. In Australia, we all have rights, but it's a process because we are a minority, and the referendum was not in black control and never can be. You know, we have a constitution, we have parliaments, we have these things that deny land rights, that deny black sovereignty. And that's not a matter of feeling guilt or saying, why was I, you know, we're past the Great Australian Silence, Henry Reynolds discussions. We're past the idea of why weren't we told? Stanner, yeah, and Henry Reynolds. So Stanner is also a good example. Yes, Great Australian Silence is Stanner. Why weren't we told was Henry Reynolds?
No, it was Stanner. Everyone knows it was Stanner.
I apologise.
The cult of forgetfulness was Stanner's. We've been talking about this for 50, 60, 70 years.
Yeah. So it's that idea of those were the discussions for settlers to have as people who have control of institutions on this continent. Now there is less silence, there is more telling, and it's up to, you know, I guess I bring it back to that thing about I'm a young writer, and I think it's been, you know, mentioned by all of us implicitly or explicitly that although I don't think that criticism should be this or that or any prescription, it is loving, and it's loving no matter how it's done, and it can still be criticised itself. But the love comes from saying that we were readers, and now as writers we're trying to bring people into a conversation, and I would like to bring people in. I don't want to cancel anything. It's not something I can achieve. No one can achieve that. It's a vanity to actually believe that, you know, on some level, a psychological vanity and a misunderstanding of, I think, what writing can be. Yes, we can cancel things, we can critique negatively, but we can also, you know, as a critic, I just try to be someone who adds and someone who's not, you know, to invoke. You know, there's an idea they call sort of paranoid reading, and the queer theorist Sedgwick, who talked about paranoid reading, which is where you read something and you say, I know they're out to get me. I know that bad things are happening, but I'll simply reiterate the point without changing the situation and without taking the struggle further. Or I'll be cynical. You know, I'll think, who's out to get me? I'm not interested in that because it's not in my control. It's not in our control as writers. We put our stuff out there to be read and therefore criticised. So, you know, we're doing it and we're having this conversation, and I think the only thing, honestly, if I could change anything, and I say this as Declan Fry and as a board member of Melbourne Writers Festival, and I've said this to my fellow board members, I would love to change the whole format of festivals. We can't have a discussion because this kind of Q&A Dick Cavett style, I do think that's finished, you know. We can, as I say, laugh, cry, enjoy it. I've enjoyed the festival, I've loved it. But I would love to see us going back and, you know, dreaming it up all over again and thinking, what can we do where we can kind of open this up and open up the audience like black communities do, like we do with our families, our friends, our loved ones. Just kind of have, you know, a genuine heart-to-heart and not have such a hierarchy maybe where it is a bit Q&A and it can fall into patterns. Yeah, I'd like to see that change.
Did you want to say something, Daniel?
No, we'll go right ahead, board member of the Melbourne Writers Festival. I mean, how are you going to... I think we have to kind of accept the form that we're in. And like this form's okay. Like, I'm sure Jane will hear if audiences have really hated us up here and you down there. I think at some point we've either earned the right to speak, and I think have earned the right to be heard. And you've been saying things for a long time, but I feel like I'm only just being heard, and I'm only just actually saying what I think. After 30 years as a journalist, giving voice to others and articulating what I think they think, I'm actually now just saying, I think this, I think, and So I'm quite happy with this kind of bardic relationship between me and you. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I don't think it's particularly broken. And if it was, you wouldn't be here.
Just on things maybe being perceived as broken, I kind of was going to mention it in the opening remarks, but just I kind of realised that we're all a panel of men and there's no women.
I know,
in
it
our
sucks.
panel. Apparently that's it's an anomaly to have this here.
Apparently most literary panels are women, so they're
Yeah.
overrepresented. That's what...
But just...
That's not me, that's what I heard.
But just, I guess, yeah, like, I wish, you know...
I love that it's all black men, though. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, I just wish that, you know, Celeste Little was up here with us, or just I think who else is out there. Melissa doesn't do critiquing, does she?
Well, actually, she's won a Walkley for long form journalism. So
Yeah.
there's a critic there.
But
Any black woman, there's a critic.
yeah, true. But I guess it's funny because in your foreword, in Daniel's book, you haven't read it. I encourage you to do so. In the foreword, she kind of says the first line is something about "I'm not a black critic." Yeah, but like I.
Well, she even
those
says,
who
"I don't
do
know
it."
much about art, but I know what I like," which is the old adage. Look, I think that's basically. I mean, Margot Butler and you know, under instruction from me, invited Melissa to write the preface and forward, and she did a beautiful job. But it's just like there's things in there that I think, you know, I didn't want someone to congratulate me, and I didn't want someone to praise me. I wanted someone who I knew would be hard, and I'm really lucky. I've had 4 hard black fellas read my work and appraise its value, and critique it. And some of that's on the record, and some of it's not. So I always put my work out to those people who I think might know whether I'm hitting the mark or not. And I like farming that decision out, and just because I don't know, it's like you're trying to judge whether you're being critical or whether you're just being a bastard. So, you know, she had a look at it and really had some nice things to say. Tony Birch also reviewed the book, and what's his name for the Australian Book Review, Philip Morrissey from the University of Melbourne. So I've had 3 blackfellas all publish their view about this book, and it's just okay. It's okay. You know, there's no spears in my back, so I'm all right. If it's just okay, I'm perfectly happy with that.
I just think, yeah, it's a beautiful example of your work in, I guess, radio journalism and just how that transcends. It's, I think, of old traditions and that trajectory of, you know, talking to each other, telling a story. You do it with radio, you did it beautifully. It's now transcribed in a book on many occasions, and it just still works. So I think it's wonderful. If you haven't got the book, it's around here somewhere close to the subject. Daniel Browning, it's beautiful. Tristan, do you want to maybe say something to close up? Or?
I mean, maybe we can keep celebrating Daniel for a second. So, I mean, in terms of thinking about that and
Tristan was one of the judges.
Yes,
Yes,
already helped award a prize for the book. But no, in thinking about Daniel's book and across the media that he's worked in, having something sit that's now under his name, that's like his work, that's not dispersed over like various different platforms, and it can be hard to identify like a central thesis when the work is so dispersed, but having it in a book enables you to do so. And yeah, and some of these, you know, other media that we've mentioned, like, to me, I think having for the future a black-led publication that invites people in, so we have authority, that is sitting, I know we've got some, I do, but like that's focused on criticism, and like people can have their work there and build their work in one place. I'd like to see what that would look like.
I think there's like a specialist issue of some magazine about black criticism, and it's also reminding people of that point, that some people like to see blackfellas have a bar fight. There's actual value in it. It's like a spectator sport. It really is. It's like people in remote towns on a Friday night, the white fellas will go there and they will spectate.
Oh, it's not just remote towns.
I know.
I'm just people who, like, from Prince of Wales.
Yeah,
and St
absolutely,
Kilda
absolutely.
there,
Love seeing black fellas fight in public.
Like that
And-
old fig tree there.
And that's not particularly edifying. What I want to have is a deep conversation about things that are really important. And in the work, there are in the artwork that I tend to review, and I generally only review work that I like, because I don't want to. My mum said, "Don't say anything. If you can't say something nice, don't say anything." I know it's really trite and kind of what a mother would say, but I kind of live by it. If I can't say something nice, I won't say it. But nice is a way you can define that however you like. But I try to find the value in something when I write about the artwork, and I also try to find the things that may not be obvious, like what's not in the painting, what's not in that work, what's not in that film. There should be the cultural context, you know, and particularly for an international audience, that's completely missing.
Yeah, I guess there's this movement that sort of came from First Nations Canada, with Yolandi Bell in the theatre, I guess, realm, where she wanted to... She created a piece called Bug. I'm not sure whether people are aware of it, but it just spawned this, I guess, this desire to have Black or First Nations critics or people of colour respond to her work. The work is very much about trauma and about the First Nations experience of trauma, colonisation, within that kind of community. And her rationale behind calling for First Nations critics was to, I guess, bring that lens of sensitivity or empathy to the work that a colonist might not have. Do you see merit in that, or...?
Can I just say, look, in relation to visual art, sorry, Declan, in relation to visual art, the criticism that has been, the published criticism about Aboriginal art has tended to focus on the things that are least important, and that is the formal elements, composition, you know, line, colour, etc., etc. The things that are bubbling away underneath that are much more interesting. I trained at art school, I know about all that shit, but it's just not interesting. It's not going to speak to another black person. I want to enlarge the work so much that other black fellas look at it, and, you know, white people too. I want it to be valid for everybody. And there's some things that are just so secreted in the work that they do sometimes. It just adds something. It deepens a conversation around culture. I mean, we're all up here. We're all contributing to culture, right? Every one of us is contributing to culture. That's what the whole thing is about, that we're engaged in. And I just want to make sure that conversation starts out with just some truth, some honesty, and some context.
I like what Daniel says about enlarging and adding, because, you know, the reason at the outset I didn't say I'm a critic is because partly, although I am a critic, of course, I practice criticism, I don't identify with that label in the sense that, first of all, it's just not how I feel, and moreover, I think that criticism is something we do all the time. It's not a discrete thing.
Not in this country, it's not. I mean, it doesn't have there's no critical mass.
And you know, so with talking about the format of the Q&A, you know, Daniel has the chance to speak, Tristan, me, Brian, and that's important. It's about bringing people in to speak, and it's not either or. So we can always speak in a variety of ways and just be adding. So I guess for me, like, you know, the thing that you've helped me to think about in this session, I mean, everyone has helped me to think about this session, is that there's a lot of either-or conversation, you know, if not me, them, if not them, me. And I think that if something, I don't think things are either-or. However, sometimes there is something irresolvable. There can be an either-or where you can't square the circle, and honestly, if you can't square a circle, then I would say get some new shapes.
I think, yeah, we might wrap it up. It's about time. So could you please join me in thanking Declan Fry, Tristan Harwood and Daniel Brown.